In our last lecture, we examined the political thought of Niccolò Machiavelli, a representative figure of the Italian or Southern Renaissance. In this lecture, we'll turn to Thomas More, an equally representative figure of the Northern Renaissance. And in many ways, he is also a stereotype of what we mean by a Renaissance man, a man who had many different talents and abilities. More was a man of great learning, an elegant writer of Latin prose, a student of classical Greek and the philosophical writings of the ancient world. He was an important member of the circle of Northern Renaissance figures associated with his close friend Erasmus of Rotterdam. He was also a member of Parliament in England, in fact had served in various diplomatic posts for English government and other administrative posts, ultimately becoming Lord Chancellor of all England. And of course, he was a Christian saint, known for his great piety and integrity, and those of you who've seen A Man for All Season know he ultimately was beheaded for his refusal to acknowledge Henry VIII's divorce from Catherine of Aragon, as well as Henry VIII's rule of the English Church. He was also a man of great wit and jest, and I would argue that that's actually critical in understanding much of the strategy of Utopia, and we'll see why in a couple minutes. But I think it's probably more important to begin with this insight, which is that what More does with Utopia and what differentiates it from, say, The Prince, and what differentiates the Northern Renaissance from the Southern Renaissance, was that while both represent a rebirth of classical learning and humanism, there's much greater tension between that tradition in the South and Christianity than there is in the North. So the Northern Renaissance often is an attempt to wed the Christian ethos, particularly Jesus' gospel of love and the moral philosophy that we find in, for example, the Beatitudes, with the wisdom of the ancient world. Now, Utopia is also famous, and justly so, as a precursor of modern communism. And while its communism is not meant entirely, I think, literally, it nonetheless, I think, to argue that it's entirely metaphor, on the other hand, is to go too far. The most obvious source for More's Utopia is Plato's Republic, which it's clearly modeled on. And that's why I mentioned that question of jest and wit, because More finds himself facing the exact same problem that Socrates faced. How does one speak truth to power? Particularly in a society which does not have a tradition of freedom of speech and dissent. Now, you'll remember that Socrates did this by deploying irony. Socrates would critique the social conventions of Athenian democracy, but then ultimately retreat behind that critique by saying, but of course, I'm not saying it's wrong, I don't know anything. I'm simply raising questions. And that worked for a while until it got annoying and they fed him some hemlock. More tried the technique of jest and wit as a way of trying to shield himself from censure. And this is important because you'll recall that, in fact, More was not executed for anything he said, but was executed for what he didn't say and what he was thought to have believed. So he uses jest in the Utopia to shield himself. The text is originally written in Latin, and almost all of the proper names in the Utopia are comic, indeed in an extremely silly and robust fashion, so that he can claim, if the doctrines are taken to be censurable, that in fact, of course they're censurable. It's a joke book. It's not to be taken seriously. For example, the name Utopia literally means no place. The Socratic figure or hero of the text, Raphael, has a last name meaning dispenser of nonsense, or nonsense talker. The basic unit of political organization in Utopia is translated from the Latin as a sty. And the people who live in them are obviously, well, pigs live in sties. And this is obviously an attempt at buffoonery and raillery. But it's also a practice of esotericism. For those in his audience who had read Plato's Republic would know that in calling the basic unit a sty, he's also referring to Plato's city of swine in the Republic, which is the city built in speech where justice takes care of itself. And then again, we'll see that is a communistic arrangement. So given its veneer of comic buffoonery, Moore hopes that Utopia is a safe venue to vent his criticisms of the prevailing social and political orders. Now, again, like the Republic, Moore's Utopia takes the form of a dialogue led by a Socratic wise man. In this case, his name is Raphael. He's a world traveler who's seen many things and knows many things. He's, in theory, has traveled with Amerigo Vespuccio and discovered the wonderful island of Utopia somewhere off the coast of what we now know as Florida. And again, like the Republic, the first book of Utopia sets the stage and issues for the next book, which is an exposition of the communal, social, and political arrangements of the utopians that Raphael observed in his travels. Briefly put, in Book 1, Moore meets Raphael in Antwerp during an ambassadorial tour and is struck by his obvious knowledge and wisdom, and they enter into a discussion of politics. And Raphael recounts his visit to England, where he spent time at the court of Cardinal John Morton, who was in fact a patron of Moore's, in which he critiqued English social practices and political practices, especially that of using the mass use of death penalty against property criminals. And obviously Raphael will point out that it's not only absurd to execute people for property crimes, you're encouraging them to commit murder as well, but it's obviously not going to deter people who have to feed starving children. Which leads ultimately to his invocation of the utopian example where things work better, where there is communism. And he says, when you get rid of private property, you get rid of crime, you get rid of property issues, you create equality and social justice. And Moore states, and I quote, "I disagree. I don't believe you'd ever have a reasonable standard of living under a communistic system. There'd always tend to be shortages because no one would work hard enough. In the absence of a profit motive, everyone would become lazy and rely on everyone else to do the work for him." And Moore is suggesting a very realistic critique, one that has certainly resonated over the centuries. And that's what allows Raphael to really make the case, which will force him to argue for utopianism in the second book, when he says, "You're bound to take that view, for you simply can't imagine what it would be like, not accurately at any rate. But if you'd been with me in Utopia and seen it all for yourself, as I did, I lived there for more than 5 years, you know, and the only reason why I ever left was that I wanted to tell people about the New World. You'd be the first to admit that you'd never seen a country so well organized." And then that brings us to Book 2. Now, Book 2, we're going to look at really three big issues. The arrangement of society, the arrangement of the government, and the utopian high culture and their basic beliefs. It's Book 2 which makes up the core of the work. I want briefly to state, however, that while utopia literally means no place, it has obviously intentional similarities to England. Like England, it is an island separated from the mainland by a small channel. Like England, it has a central capital, much like London, and it has exactly 54 towns, the number Moore counted in England in his own time. Okay. So let's turn to the organization of utopian society. And of course, as I've mentioned, everything is owned by the community. The household is the locus of production. This is important to keep in mind because prior to the 19th century, the household was not only the place where children were raised and educated, it was also the place where almost everyone worked. Right? If you wanted to learn a trade, your father was a carpenter, you wanted to be a blacksmith, you found a blacksmith who would take you on as an apprentice, and you moved into his household and became a member of his family. And that same set of arrangements is found in the Utopia. It's again, so basic unit of society is the household, which is both reproductive and productive. Trades are assigned on the basis of aptitude as well as choice. Again, in that household mode of production, there's one exception, and that is agricultural labor, which Moore felt was extremely undesirable. So to that end, Moore, or rather the utopians, I should say, institute a conscription or a draft. All people are required for 2 years of their life to serve as agricultural laborers, and they're rotated. If additional labor is needed at harvest time, it's supplied by slaves, and we'll talk about slaves time permitting. Well, since everyone works in utopia, there are no nobles, there are no lords, there are no rentiers. Since everyone labors, the workday is actually only 6 hours long, with a fairly long break in the middle. And that's because the utopians treasure leisure over possessions. Now, let me point out that leisure in utopia is not idleness. One does not sit at home when one is not working and daydream. It's spent either studying music or attending public lectures on philosophy and science and astronomy and ethics and religion. Or it can be spent with hobbies like gardening. The utopians love gardening, much as the English do, an obvious reference there. If you don't have a hobby, then you must spend your spare time at home working, doing additional labor. And indeed, if you choose to do that, you're respected for it. You're seen as a sort of hero of the community, sacrificing for the good of all. Again, there are some fairly uniform arrangements for household life. Everyone beds at night at exactly 8 o'clock. Everyone sleeps for at least 8 hours. There is very little in the way of privacy. Houses have no locks, and doors are never kept intentionally closed to keep other people out. Indeed, if you wish to travel from one town to another, you need a permit from the local authorities, which will then require you, if you spend more than 2 days on your travels, to work and begin practice your occupation in the town that you're visiting. Now, there are other sorts of work which utopian citizens don't do, and that is, again, dirty work. And perhaps the best example of that is the butchering of animals. And more, had utopians not practiced butchering, because he felt that it desensitized people to cruelty. So utopian citizens were barred from butchering. And again, for that, to do that labor, they used slaves. Well, I've mentioned that the household is the locus of production. It is also intensely patriarchal, much like the contemporary European household. Which is to say, the eldest male, gerontocratic male, is the head of the household. A household which usually includes somewhere between 10 to 16 adults and all the attendant children. There's a practice of monthly auricular confession. Children confess their sins to their parents. Wives confess their sins to their husbands. Although marriage is based on love, and marriage matches, since there is no property, are not arranged, nonetheless adultery and fornication are serious crimes, sometimes punished by slavery. All houses are maintained publicly. They are public property. And they're all roughly identical, as is clothing. People wear homespun uniforms. Indeed, to make sure people don't gain an attachment to the houses they're living in, everybody moves out of their house and switches houses every 10 years. Finally, food is generally consumed at public dining halls. It's not mandated, but the food there is so good that one would be foolish to ever eat at home. And again, the same gerontocratic patriarchal relations are mirrored in that place. The old eat first and get the pick of the choicest foods, and the young wait on them in tables. Dinner is accompanied by light moral and philosophical discussion, poetry and music, again supervised by the elders. Okay. So that's the social arrangements of the utopia, and we might see that there are real similarities between that and the social arrangements of the Republic, as well as what the Republic is based on Sparta. Let's look now at the government. The most basic unit of utopian government I've mentioned before is the sty, which is made up of 30 households. These 30 households elect a sty leader or sty ward, and for every 10 sty wards there is a bench eater, also known as a senior district councillor. All of these offices, these local offices, are elective, and they are held for one-year terms. But the sty wards, and there's 200 of them per town, elect the mayor. And the mayor serves for life unless he is impeached for malfeasance, incompetence, or crime. Now, in all utopian political arrangements, there are a couple interesting regulations regarding deliberation. First of all, there are no political discussions allowed outside of chambers. This is critical. If you cannot discuss political issues off of, say, the Senate floor, then you cannot cut a deal in the Senate cloakroom. That arrangement is clearly meant to forestall faction and political negotiation. You are forced to speak and vote simply on the basis of the merits of a case. Similarly, no legislation can be discussed on the day it is introduced, an attempt to forestall passionate responses and produce more rational deliberation. And indeed, this does in some way mirror the arrangements of the English Parliament, where every bill must be read three different times and passed 3 different times before it finally is moved on to the next chamber. Now, as for the overall structure of utopian government, its centralized administration, the towns elect delegates to a national parliament, which is headed by a prince who is elected but serves for life. This national parliament's primary function really has 2 of them, or 3, I should say. One is to allocate goods and labor in times of shortage, to get constant and accurate information about where the harvest is going well and where there are food shortages, so that extra labor and resources can be distributed in a rational fashion. Its second goal is to set foreign policy. And closely allied with that, and we'll talk about foreign policy before too long, is the dispatch of colonists. Again, a policy that the ancient Greeks practiced, that the ancient Romans practiced, and that before too long the English would practice in the New World. I mention this because it's remarkable what's not included on that list, which is to say the national parliament does not legislate. It does not pass laws. And this is for that old-fashioned Platonic reason, that if you don't have private property, you really don't need legislation. Right? You can simply use equity and common sense and right reason to govern a society. And the notion is that if, in fact, you do need legislation, your society is unjust, and no amount of laws will ever help it. And that's an argument we saw in the Republic as well. Nonetheless, there are perverse figures who, despite communism, will attempt to steal communal property. They are enslaved, as are prisoners captured in war, and actually volunteers, people who are foreigners, and show up and ask to be enslaved. And that may seem strange, except when you recall that utopians only work 6 hours a day, and the slaves really don't work much more. They're certainly better kept than most citizens and peasants anywhere else in the world. Only recalcitrant criminals are executed. If slaves show true repentance, labor for the good of the community, they are released from their fetters, which are, by the way, made of gold, and are given all of the privileges and rights of full utopian citizens. So the goal is rehabilitation. Finally, it's worth noting the role of the governors in their Platonic aspect, which is to say that those who hold the highest political offices are very much, as in the Republic, philosopher kings. Which is to say, you cannot actually be elected to the national parliament or made a prince unless you are part of the class of scholarly intellectuals. Now, to enter the class of scholarly intellectuals, you must show merit, which is done by testing. And in fact, there is real social mobility into this class. If you are, for example, trained as a carpenter, but attend public lectures on astronomy, find it fascinating, and display a real disposition and knack for astronomy, you're allowed to switch your vocation. Indeed, one can become and remain an intellectual as long as one's high cultural work, one's scientific and humanistic researches, is satisfactory. And in fact, within that class of intellectuals, there are exactly 3 different vocations. There are teachers, those who give the public lectures and train future scholars. There are priests, and only intellectuals can be priests. And then there are, of course, the rulers, who are, although popularly elected, chosen from the class of that intellectual elite. Okay, let's turn to the discussion of trade and commerce, which the utopians engage in quite extensively, much like the English. And they do so to procure primarily iron, which they consider the only useful metal. And again, I think there's a very clear allusion to England here, which also engaged in trade to procure iron, which they lacked in large quantities. But they do acquire precious metals nonetheless, gold and silver. But they're used only for further trade because foreign nations find them useful, and particularly for bribery abroad, since they have no value or use value within utopian society. So they use extra gold, as I mentioned, as fetters for slaves, as chamber pots for spittoons, and they give jewelry to children as we would give them rattles and baubles, so that they can enjoy them until they're about 3 or 4 and then realize how childish they really are. And that brings us to the final part of our political arrangements, which is the practice of war and foreign policy. Now, utopians fight wars for only 3 reasons. 1, to defend their own territories and citizens, right? So, essentially, defensive projects. Secondly, they will defend the territory and maybe even citizens of an ally. And third, and this is where we get, again, that heavy Christian element, to liberate oppressed peoples. Again, like in Plato's Republic, they sign no treaties with their allies, based on that same rationale. If their allies are reasonable and equitable people, then they don't need a treaty, because they know that they'll be obliged to follow right reason and do what the right thing is. If, however, their allies are, how should we say, Machiavellian in their nature, then it's pointless to sign treaties. They'll break them whenever it's in their interest. Right? They'll practice realpolitik. So treaty making is not part of their foreign policy. But they are nonetheless capable of real deviousness, particularly when it comes to the fighting of wars. And that's because their primary goal, once they're engaged in a war, is to save as many utopian lives as possible. So what they'll do is, if nation X declares war on Utopia, they will immediately have spies go into nation X and post in every market square large posters saying, wanted, dead, or alive, and then list all of the military and political leaders of nation X. And because they stockpile gold and don't actually, use it for anything else, they can pay immense rewards. And not surprisingly, there's almost nothing people won't do for gold and silver, so they generally don't even have to fight wars when enemies declare them, because the citizens of the enemy country simply bring in the leaders and are always paid as promised. If that doesn't work, they're more than happy to buy off the opposing army when they've meet it in the field, and simply say to the opposing general, whatever your leaders are paying you, we'll double or triple that, and they always keep their word on that. If that doesn't work, their next line of defense is to use mercenaries whenever possible. And in their case, they use a group called the Venalians, who are clearly modeled on the Swiss, the great mercenaries of Renaissance Europe. And their practice is to pay the Venalians quite well, to put them in the line of fire and danger as quickly and as often as possible, so that as many of them will die as possible, because they consider any people who think warfare is a respectable profession, as a full-time vocation, barbarians and dangerous to the human species. No utopians are ever requested to fight abroad, but they are all required to defend utopia in defensive wars. And indeed, even the women are trained for combat. And if they choose, they are more than welcome to accompany their husbands and fight at the front. At the cessation of hostilities, utopians exact reparations, not from their allies who they've helped, but from the defeated aggressor. And they leave the spoils of war to their allies to make sure that they will always have trusted supporters. They also, again, quite in contrast to contemporary European practices, give quarter and aid to all of those whom they've conquered who were non-combatants. So they never attack anyone but the opposing army, and always give quarter and succor to their citizens of their foes. All right, let's talk a bit in the remaining minutes about utopian culture, which was clearly an attempt to combine the very best of the ancient classical tradition with the Christian goals of equality and faith. Well, the first thing to note is that utopian religion is intensely ecumenical, which is to say it is a set policy to make sure that it is broad enough in its practice not to produce sectarian differences. For example, all cathedrals are kept dark, so that people will be placed in a contemplative mood. Prayers are always non-sectarian, right? They are always general enough that almost any different interpretation of religion will allow you to, in good conscience, embrace those prayers. There are no images in houses of worship, because each utopian is encouraged to imagine God as he or she chooses. Their priests are scholars, as I've mentioned, and are not required to be celibate. In fact, they can marry if they wish. All utopians and all priests are encouraged to believe in one God. That and the belief in human immortality and punishment, i.e. heaven and hell, are the only doctrines of utopian religion. In fact, utopian society demands religious toleration as a set policy. Indeed, even atheists and materialists are tolerated. Though, it is worth noting, they're not allowed to speak publicly and advocate their position, and they cannot vote or hold office as long as they reject the belief in one God and the immortality of the soul, and that is because the utopians don't believe then that they have any moral, metaphysical basis to actually have moral convictions. Nonetheless, such atheists are encouraged to dispute with priests in the hope that those priests will eventually recover them from their errors. They're priests quite contrary to what we'd find in Christianity, but quite in keeping with what we'd find in Utopia, counsel euthanasia for the diseased and the bedridden. But it is not prescribed or enforced, and there is no stigma to staying alive in a publicly maintained hospital. But if you do choose to end your life and stop being a burden on society as a whole, you are, of course, celebrated as a hero. Raphael also recounts that the utopians were extremely avid for Christianity when they heard about it. It immediately struck them that what Jesus preached was, in fact, the exact truth which they have practiced in utopian society. Well, let's talk a bit about utopian moral theory. And here's where the heavy Greek influence comes in, because utopian moral theory and moral philosophy is, in fact, eudaimonistic, or happiness-oriented. And indeed, Raphael claims to, quote, chide the utopians by saying their eudaimonism veers a bit too much towards hedonism, in that they think that happiness consists largely, at least, in pleasure. And this is, in fact, supported by their religion, because they think that God made each person to be happy. And they supplement their moral theory with religion because they believe that reason on its own is, though important in establishing religion, insufficient. Okay, so their first principle in establishing their morality is that the immortal soul, which God made, is made to be happy. And that, therefore, God punishes and rewards us in the afterlife for our actions in producing our own happiness and contributing to the happiness of others. So this means that God himself believes that pleasure is good. And if it is good for me, then it must be good for you. And if it is good for us, it must be good for everyone. Which means that we can deduce we should have no pleasure that comes at the expense of others. In fact, the utopians have several arguments to the effect that selfless pleasure, that is to say, giving pleasure to others, is a profound source of personal pleasure. Obviously, such acts of kindness are often repaid, and therefore, if one gives pleasure to someone else, one can expect that pleasures will be returned. But secondly, there is an intense personal satisfaction and personal fulfillment that comes from giving pleasure to others and contributing to their happiness. And finally, there is the eternal reward that we get from God for being good and contributing to the happiness and well-being of our fellow creatures. Thus, happiness is the goal of human endeavor, even of virtuous action. Now, what do we mean by pleasure? Well, they define pleasure as any naturally enjoyable state. Keep in mind, this is a hedonism much like that of Epicurus, not like that of Caligula or Nero. Which is to say, pleasures don't include things like wearing fine clothing, keeping up with the Joneses, gambling, hunting. All of these pleasures create pains. It obviously doesn't include excesses of food or alcohol all of which cause pains. And anything which causes pain to someone else is obviously not a pleasure. So what are the pleasures? Well, there are two sorts, mental and physical. Physical pleasures they consider lower. The higher pleasures, the greatest pleasures, are those that are associated with the contemplation of eternal truth and the realization of a life well lived. And it's at that point that I'd like to conclude this lecture, because it's that way that Moore wants to argue you can take the eudaimonism of the ancient Greeks and wed it to the ethos of Christ. I've no doubt that either self-interest or the authority of our Savior Christ, who was far too wise not to know what was best for us and far too kind to recommend anything else, would have led the whole world to adopt the utopian system long ago if it weren't for that beastly root of all evils, pride. For pride's criterion of prosperity is not what you've got yourself, but what other people haven't got.